Welcome back. And just for the sake of it, I don't know if you noticed or not, but I shaved before the last one, after the AP test was over, changed my shirt, even though I'm doing back to back, but I want to make it look like it's multiple days going on, because time never stands still for history teachers. It never does. It's always moving. The past is constantly right at the edge of the breaker of the ship, going through icebergs of... I need to get out of this house. I need to get out of this house. I need to see people again. Let's talk about the Cold War, shall we? It will be more fun than you think you should have. Honestly, high point of the quarantine. You look back at it years from now, you're going to go like, that damn lecture on the Cold War. That I would have done the whole coronavirus quarantine over again for. Just that lecture. That whole kind of algebraic equation, d squared is always less than or equal to c squared, which is always greater than. I still don't know what that means, but I will soon. 1946. It's supposed to be plus, but somehow or another didn't come across, equals the Cold War. That's what that means. Anyways, let's get down to it. We left off with the idea that at the end of the war, we got our biggest, bestest friends in the world, the Soviet Union, more comfortably known as Russia. So they are our big buddies, along with the British in World War II, and they are the big three. I almost said World War III there. The World War III, the big two. Anyway, so the big three will work together. Again, Winston Churchill said, I would walk through hell holding the hand of the devil himself. To defeat Hitler, I would certainly at least massage Stalin's back, his tight muscles. That totalitarianism takes a big stress on a man. So we worked with each other to defeat this global threat, Adolf Hitler and the German Wehrmacht, and the early research that they were doing on the atomic bomb. So we were warned by Albert Einstein and other scientists that had left Germany. They were the ones to first invent jets. They were working on some sonar type stuff, some pulse power. They were doing all kinds of stuff. So they were the guys we needed to get out of there. So we worked together as a group. Now remember, if you watch the other two videos, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, very Machiavellian, just like these other two guys is using them, and they're using us, and it's all the way that things go. So we're giving money, we're giving know-how, we're giving industrial kind of information, we're helping the Russians figure out how to do what they do. They are giving their lives. They will lose millions upon millions, possibly as high as 15 to 20 or 25 million when you count the soldiers and actually the citizens that died. 1 million will die up in just the siege of Leningrad alone. The United States will lose a lot. 350,000 to 370. I've seen some historians push it up to 400. It's a lot. It's a lot. And it's not to be belittled, but the Russians paid the blood price for this war. We were the arsenal of democracy. And the British kept the Germans kind of bottled up so they could never quite get out of the European theater. Their Navy did what we needed it to do. And between the three of us, we were a pretty good trio. A big three, shall we say. Well, everything worked out okay. The big bad Nazis were defeated. Sooner or later, the big bad Japanese were defeated. Italy defeated pretty, well, not easily, but they went down too. So we entered the war friends. Look at those guys. They're having a great time. But it didn't stay that way for long. So the big three will not stay happy for very long at all. So what we end up having is Stalin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Churchill, and they are already, as World War II is ending, they're already starting to figure out what we're going to do in the aftermath. And the aftermath is the United States has millions of soldiers over the seas. And we need to bring them back. People want them home. They want their sons home. They want their husbands home. They want to see their father. And Truman's getting an incredible amount of pressure to bring these boys home. And if you were living in the era with this kind of propaganda that had been raining down since the Committee of Public Information's newest version, the Office of War Information, how can you not think it's a glorious time? We had seen Hollywood movies that have proclaimed the great kind of like contributions of the Russians. In a group of movies that Hollywood turned out in conjunction with the Office of War Information, they created this Why We Fight series. And if we were in class right now, I would have done an amazing dance for you. Just ask any other students that I've ever had before. It is exquisite. It is the move that I did use for my audition for the Russian ballet, but they said that I was not Russian enough. So I was turned down. So anyways, I went to become a history teacher when I didn't have a chance to... I would have done a dance for you, and it would be amazing. You would remember it forever. And if you ask people, they'll tell you about that. But the Russians were painted as these incredible people that were our friends. in the movies and the writings of the time period, Time Magazine, all the exposés, I mean, it was a full court press to get America to basically forget that these guys were communists, that Stalin was Stalin, he's Uncle Joe. These guys are our friends. They're our friends. I mean, they're our friends. There's nobody on the earth that is more like us than Russia, we were shown in those propaganda movies of World War II. They were a multi-ethnic, hodgepodge nation that covered a massive span of land, just like ours, even though we could fit 3 of us and 1 of them. We are led to believe that Russia is very similar to us. For God's sakes, they use in their name a U, an S, and an A, and another S and an R and an I. But so why not bring my boys home? Well, the reason why is Roosevelt already knew, and Harry Truman, who took over after Roosevelt died on that April 12th in Warm Springs, Georgia, knew. Stalin is a totalitarian dictator. He was from the moment he probably had Lenin offed, or at least took advantage of it when Lenin died, and he was until the day he died in 1953. There have not been many more brutal dictators in the world than Stalin. So Uncle Joe had a mean streak. So if we're going to bring our soldiers home, and if we're not going to keep them up at that level, the only way we're going to be able to bring them home is if we have friends in Europe, and if we have the atomic bomb to threaten the Soviet Union. And that was one of the reasons that the atomic bomb ultimately was used. It was to send a very strong message to the Soviet Union. Stalin, Uncle Joe, come over here a second. Let me just say this. If you think the United States can be pushed around simply because we're bringing home all those men, think again. We use these weapons on an enemy that no longer pose a threat to us. You don't think we use them on your armies? Try us. From 1945, when the war ended, on that August 15th, when Emperor Hirohito called an end to the fighting, the Soviet Union took no more land until 1979 in Afghanistan. Message received. Now, when we talk about the Vietnam War, we're also going to talk about the idea about why, if we're going to have a partner in Europe to counterbalance this huge, big, massive army, the largest the world had seen, and we're not going to have our men there because we're going to bring them back home because everybody at home has been convinced that these guys over there are our friends. I mean, they're our friends. So if we're going to bring them home, we're going to have to bring them home. So we need something to hold them in place. So between our partnership with Britain and France and our rebuilding of Germany, which will turn into one of our closest allies, ironically, which is hard for people to take that quick shift, that 180-degree turn, that our worst enemy, Germany, is all of a sudden now going to be one of our best friends in Europe. Our worst enemy, Japan, will now be our best friend in Asia. Our worst, basically, enemy, Russia, will become our best friend, will become our enemy. This kind of gymnastics is hard for most people to keep track of. I can barely balance my fantasy football league, not fantasy football, fantastic four. Reed Richards. So when we dropped those atomic bombs, a whole bunch of things started happening real quickly. So we have our war. As we said before, in 1946, as you know, the economy is going to go like spiraling up and down, and it's going to go back and forth. That is going to be the year where we bring in a whole lot of people that will become famous later on as freshman congressmen representing California. This is Richard M. Milhouse Nixon, representing Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Again, they will be friends and buddies together. Ronald Reagan will start making his move towards politics, getting away from Hollywood at the time period when he does his testimonies in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Hollywood 10 trials that we'll talk about a little bit today. And then we'll also talk about the Berlin Airlift, and then Soviet Union taking over, and then China falling. And next thing you know, boom, biddy, boom, biddy, boom, biddy, boom, we're going to get ourselves into a Korean War, McCarthyism, and every other fun thing that's behind my head over here. So that's what we're doing today. So Stalin goes from being Uncle Joe to the bad guy. And it's pretty amazing how fast, within about 2 years, we start shifting to him being a bad guy. I mean, look at him. He's like this super villain throwing everybody off of the earth with his sickle and hammer and grumpy. That almost looks like, I don't know. Who does that look like? Star from the 80s. Anyways. The Russians had gone from being who they were to who they always were, and we were not going to stand by. So to bring our boys home, we're going to have to do something to keep this communism enemy from taking over the rest of the world. We're going to have to do something. And by 1946, the first full year of peace, Harry Truman is going to ask former Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill, who had been beaten in the 1945 labor elections when they won. He's going to come to Fulton, Missouri, and give a speech that he will announce that there's a new era in Europe, that behind an iron curtain, Joe Steele, that's what Stalin means in Russian, behind an iron curtain, or so I've been told, because I don't know anything more of Russian than "da!" But that these countries that have been freed from Germany have now been taken prisoner, in essence, behind an iron curtain, and we don't know what's going on in those. When he gave this speech at Fulton, Missouri, not only did he crack up Harry Truman, because he's a funny guy with that kind of like dry British wit. I mean, look at that. You can tell that's a delivery line right there. Two nuns and a priest walk into a bar in Scotland, and then and one way or another, what you end up having then is the specter that he's beginning to create of the Soviet Union rising as the new, more devious threat to the world than even Hitler was, which isn't true, but it's arguable. And that kind of idea that was so powerful in World War II, that there's an us in the world that are the good guys, and there's a them in the world that are the bad guys. That's going to be one of the legacies of World War II that we're going to still struggle with, even in our modern kind of like way of looking at stuff, that Stalin is actually just this, Beelzebub kind of thing. It's not Stalin, he's devil. And then it plays into our politics all over the place. Comrade Obama, the hope yet of the masses, and Putin and his bromance with Trump. This is the way we're going to start playing our game, good versus evil. It's not new, but it is what it is. All right, so ready? Drop down a line however you need to in your notes. One of the most important lessons we learned from World War II that will formulate almost all of the American foreign policy for the next 50 some odd years is a lesson we think we learned when Hitler started screaming and yelling and saying that he needed to take the Sudetenland, which is this little strip of like mountain valley on the backside of the Czechoslovakian country in 1938 that about 1 million Germans lived in. And he threatened to go to war if he wasn't appeased. And appeased means you make someone happy by giving in to them what they want because you don't want them getting pissed off. So in 1938, Prime Minister of the time period, Neville Chamberlain, flew to meet with Hitler. They met in Munich, Germany in 1938. And basically, Neville Chamberlain, along with Dell'Orto from France, just basically gave that Czechoslovakian strip away to Germany without even mentioning it to the Czechoslovakians themselves, President Beneš. It is seen as what is known as appeasement. This is a word you got to have down, you got to have down, you got to have down, you got to have down. I love you, will you marry me? Even though the AP test is done, you got to know this word because basically this is the biggest lesson we think we learned from World War II. Don't let bullies get away with stuff. If you let a bully steal a little lollipop from a girl, next thing you know, he's going to be dropping an atom bomb on you. You've got to stand up to bullies. You give them an inch, they take a mile. You give them Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, they're going to try to take all of Europe. That's appeasement. To appease means to give in, to make someone happy so they won't be mad. And that's what the Munich Pact was. Now, at the moment, of course, Neville Chamberlain thought he was keeping us from World War II. My good friends, for the second time in our history, that's really close to it, actually. A British Prime Minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace in our far time. Go home and get a good, nice, quiet sleep before the bombs start falling again. This is the Munich Pact, and it leads to what is known as appeasement. So the lesson we learned from World War II is don't let Hitler, Stalin have an inch. I mean, Stalin, Hitler, no wait. Don't let Kim Jong-un have an inch. Don't let that nasty dictator Fidel Castro have... Why do I keep tripping on these dictators' names? Don't let him have anything. Meaning, the United States now is going to engage itself in a never-ending global kind of security system where we're going to keep an eye on anything that the Soviets might try to take. Because if they take one, next thing you know, it's going to be like that guy sitting out there with a bucket on Halloween night when he wants to go to somebody else's house. He says, just take one. Boom, whole bucket gone. So what we learn is that we need to contain, this is the word you're going to need to know for the long time in your life, not an AP test nor a final for us right now, but in the long term, the United States policy then is going to be to contain the Soviet Union. Do not let them get out. Don't let them take another step. threaten them with the atomic bomb if we need to threaten them with the atomic bomb, because if they take anything more, then they're going to think they can take more than that. And a handful of experts at the time period, most importantly, George Kennan, who was a kind of an expert on the Soviet Union, Russia, basically said Russia only respects strength. They don't respect anything other than strength. You can be diplomatic all you want, but they're going to try to screw around with you in the behind. You got to be able to just let them know you will bash them hard. So containment means don't let them out. It's like a virus. Ooh, contain the COVID virus. Damn, we didn't do that very well. Now, this will later on end up being known as the domino theory under Dwight David Eisenhower, but it's the same basic idea. You let one domino fall, sooner or later all the dominoes fall, and the last domino is the United States. So we got to keep the dominoes standing upright. We can't let the Soviets take anything more. That's a lesson we learned from World War II. So here's a little political cartoon with Stalin over here going like, excuse me, Vladimir, within Russia means like, don't say label. No, it sounds like something. Anyways, the British guy and the American guy all kind of sitting there doing their thing. So we're going to reach on over, and he's going to try to take over the rest of Europe one way or another. That's what this political cartoon obviously is showing. Although it doesn't seem like he's like really reaching so much as he's like just putting a little pin in it. Like, I want that one, I want that one. He's going to smoke his little cigar. Although he really smoked cigarettes a lot. But anyways, appeasement then is going to be the process of taking over these big chunks of territory because someone let them. So the way we stop them is we don't let them take anything, containment. And that's what the containment is going to really mean. All right, so here's the other element of the actual Cold War that we need to kind of factor in. And this is the part that isn't so glorious, but it's realistic, and it's very much about the story. Remember when we talked way back in the beginning of the year, the idea that we needed to figure out, are we more mom, are we more dad, are we more what's in it for everybody and what's good to do, or are we in it for our personal self-interest? And the answer is it's always a little bit of all those things. But when you really want to get down to it, the money part will almost always answer most things. So let's take a little quick look at where we've been at this time period. Population and production. In other words, if the population of the country grows and we continue to make more stuff, then our people can buy the stuff we make. Now, if the people buy all the stuff that we make, then we'll have 100% employment because we'll need everyone working to make all the stuff that we're now basically making. But where is this going to go over time? So let's just take a look really quick because there's a relationship here. In 1860, as the Civil War was beginning, there was about 31 million people in the United States. About 20 million in the north, and about 11 million in the south. And the two then fought each other, right? Well, at the time period of 1890 then, roughly 30 years later, our population is going to more than double, about 63 million. And then by 1910, it's going to be sitting there at 92 million. Now, for those of you kind of going like, why all the zeros? Let's not remember, that's a census. So 0 years are census years. So what we're doing is we're growing slowly but surely, bit by bit, through immigration, through natural kind of evolution, through a lot of people just getting married and having babies and all that kind of stuff. So we end up getting ourselves up to 106 million. And by the time period that we're getting at the end of World War II, we're around 161 million. Roughly half of what we are right now. So, again, the best of all worlds is that we would make enough stuff for our people to buy, and there would be enough stuff left over we could sell to Europe, sell to Asia, sell to someplace that wants to buy it, Latin America. And as long as that selling is happening, then the economy is going to stay pretty good. Now, the problem comes when our factories start getting a little too productive. If they start getting so efficient that a factory can make 1,000 things, of which then our people only buy 800, if we can't sell the other 200 to somebody, then the factories are going to start to pull back and they're only going to make 900 or maybe 810 or maybe only 800 if that's all people actually are going to buy. And that then causes overproduction. If we are overproducing something, then the factories start pulling back, which means they start laying people off. People get laid off. Next thing you know, they're like, I don't have a job. I don't have much money. Maybe we shouldn't go buy that new thing. And some other factory someplace goes, dang, all these people used to buy 800 of our things. Now they're only buying 750 of our things. So then they lay off some people. And the thing spirals down and spirals down and spirals down. Handfuls of studies have been done during the Great Depression to try to figure out what was it. Why could we not get ourselves out of this Great Depression? And what they found was quite simply that the problem with the United States is that we've begun to become so efficient and so good at making things that we needed to sell outside of our country to other places, say China, jumping off of the Philippines. That we had become so good at making things that we were not able to buy all the things that we made. So we'd either have to raise tariffs like the Payne-Aldrich tariff in 1910 did, and that's what's going to kill the Taft presidency. Or later on, by 1920s, after World War I, having made all the things that we sold to Britain and France and then ourselves used in World War I, we found that the United States productive capability was really too big for what it was that we had to consume. So in the 1920s, we started doing a couple of different little things. We started cutting taxes on the rich, as we saw before, and we also started the idea of kind of let's let people buy stuff under what we would call kind of like consumerism, lending them money now so they can buy something they want that they don't have money for. And it also led then in 1930 to the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, when everything was said and done, where we, in other words, to get people to buy our stuff and not buy European stuff, we put one of the biggest tariffs we ever had, and that caused the world to go into Great Depression. By 1942-43, the economic advisors / investigators who had looked at kind of what was it that made this Great Depression so different than any other one we ever had was basically something along the lines of like a total system collapse. That following World War I, our factories were just so productive that they made more than we would buy. And if people outside of our country, Britain, France, Germany, anywhere else, don't buy the leftovers, we will be in a state of consistent and never-ending economic recession. Unemployment skyrocketing. That's because of how effective and how successful we were at the end of World War II. World War I. Now remember, had Hoover known what we knew, we would in essence have changed. That's what we did. So the Cold War, to a certain extent, is also about Keynesian economics. And that's us right there from basically, well, let me get this off. That is us from 1940 on through 1970 when this chart was made. If you look over here, history-wise, ups and downs and 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 ups and downs. If Keynesian economics says that if the economy wants to keep humming along, then the economy's got to keep humming along, but what can really keep it jump-started is the United States government. It can build roads, it can build hospitals, it can build schools, it can hire healthcare workers, it can do all kinds of things. It could fight a war, even if it's a cold war. Constantly pulling out the credit card and buy some more stuff, build some more bombers, build some more destroyers, build some more tanks, hire some more soldiers. And that'll keep the economy humming along pretty well. And if you notice, all the way up, just compare. Look at those little guys, those little reds, compared to those big. So one of the elements of the Cold War is an economic financial element. Then it's just got to be something we've got to be able to talk about. It is part of the things that we need to understand, that American foreign policy is partly about not just keeping markets open, but keeping markets from falling to the Soviets, because every time a market fell to the Soviets then said this country is no longer going to buy your stuff, or at least not a lot of it. See, capitalism and communism are pretty much mortal enemies. So say Hitler and Stalin before they did their non-aggression pact. These two don't really coexist very well. So if the only thing we found out in 1944 going into 45 that kept the American economy running is being able to sell outside of our borders, and that was before the war that made World War I look like a warm-up game. If you remember, that was World War I, boom, that's World War II. The things go way off the charts for the United States, way off the charts. That's so far off the charts I had to actually factor it. So this is what World War I looked like when I gave it to you before, and it popped up almost at the very top. This is going to be World War II. It's even bigger. So here's the thing. We became the arsenal of democracy. We basically made the stuff with which the World War II was fought, at least from the Allied side. Thankfully, we weren't selling them to the Germans, although they did continue to do some work with IBM and Ford Motor Company. But anyways, this is Henry Ford. In Willow Run, he made a plant that was the pinnacle of war efficiency. He was kicking out one of these B-24 bombers about once every half hour or so. And these things are huge things. Not like they started from scratch, but on an assembly line kind of thing, they just, boom, there'd be another one, boom, there'd be another one, boom, there'd be another one, about 50 a day. This is how we won the war. The problem was that kind of efficiency that you need to win the war leads to really big overproduction in peacetime. We are in the same problem we were in at the end of World War I. Our factories are too efficient. We need to be able to sell outside of our own borders. So, at the end of World War II, on our next census, when everything else is said and done, that's kind of where we are. Now, we can sell a lot of stuff internally by getting people that yellow band there and yellow band there. Basically, it's consumerism. We can get people to buy stuff that they really don't need, convince them that they really, really do need it. But we're going to have to do some other kind of things. So this is one of the things we're going to talk about now is the economic kind of jump starting of Europe. Having had it been devastated by World War II, we're not only going to basically jumpstart Europe, we're going to rebuild our enemies. Sorry about that. I had to click in there to get you out of the way. We're going to rebuild our enemies in this war. We're going to pick up Germany and spend billions upon billions upon billions of dollars to rebuild Germany. We're going to do the same thing with Japan and Italy. And we're going to convince our own people that they need to buy things that they really don't need, that this is last year's color. This is last year's color. This is so out of fashion. Man, the new car rides like a dream. That old model. This is what we're going to be calling consumer advertising, and it's going to begin the beginning of the thinking in our minds of selling to ourselves this idea that we're never happy unless we have more. It is suburban keeping up with the Joneses, it's called. And the idea that you just have to always have a little bit more than you had before. Not that that's evident anywhere around where we live. Everybody's always happy with exactly what they have. The way we have to keep the economy running is by not letting any other country fall to communism, because then there's another customer gone. That is the economic financial element of the Cold War. So what we mean by this calculation then down here is D squared is always less than or equal to C squared plus 1946 equals the Cold War. That's where we're going. So let me give you the D squared and the C squared, and then we'll explain the 1946 in just a second. D squared is the way I kind of remember hearing this, that this was a war of democracy versus. And I was often told in high school, communism, democracy versus communism. So D squared, democracy. But really what it was democracy, the right of people to vote to control their government, versus dictatorships. Those are governmental systems. A representative government, a republic, is different than a totalitarian dictatorship. A totalitarian dictatorship, I don't care if it is Stalin, I don't care if it's Hitler, I don't care if it's Kim Jong-un, I don't care if it's Putin. One person, more or less, is running the whole show. Democracy means majority rule. Democratic Republic. It's never more important than C squared, communism versus capitalism. So here's the less than or equal to. When you look at the long history of the Cold War, there's almost no exception that if it became an issue of would the United States support a democratic movement of the people, if that movement of the people was beginning to move their country away from buying our stuff versus a dictatorship that would then fight vigorously communism, even if the communism was in their own country, the United States, when pushed to the task, would almost always end up supporting dictators. The country that said all men are created equal, that got the whole game with the modern constitutional system started, will make sure that the countries around the world will buy our stuff. And when we have to choose, as you'll see, and if we had more time in class and we would have been doing this face-to-face, you would have seen more examples. The United States tends to support some really pretty nasty dictators in the Cold War era, as long as they supported our economic foreign policy. So 1946 obviously is a midterm election year after the fourth time that Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1944, I mean, how many fours do you need? A fourth election in 44. You remember that for forever. In 1946, the Republican Party is going to take it back over, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the Cold War, since it's not really us fighting them and them fighting us, the Cold War, in essence, is a war between people that are our friends. And in the world of foreign policy, we call these proxy wars, in which somebody will be your puppet. They will fight in your stead. They will fight instead of you. They will be your proxy. They will carry out the wishes for you, and that is a proxy war. So the United States will never directly fight the Soviet Union, but man, we have a lot of things that we do between each other. We give money to one guy, they give money to the next guy, and next thing you know in these proxy wars, as you look through the time period, a lot of them are happening in the former colonies of Europe. Having fought a world war the second time around, having said to the rest of the world that this is about freedom and democracy versus totalitarian dictatorships by Hitler or anybody else. A lot of countries around the world kind of say, wow, so you guys are willing to go to war to save Poland from Germany. What about saving India from Britain? We'd sure like to be on our own. What about saving the Congo from Belgium? We'd sure like to be on our own. What about saving the Philippines from the United States? We'd sure like to be on our own. So these are often going to be known as wars of liberation to the people in those, but they will often be the kind of same game. So what you have in almost all these yellow areas that will get their freedom in this time period, there will be areas that will fight, are a colonial elite that have been propped up by the colonizing power. So England wouldn't stay with millions of men in all those countries. They would take the country over and they would then prop up a monarchical regime. They would then pour a bunch of money and cooperation into the monarchical regime, and then they would then jointly kind of rule the country. They would pay to have a local army built up of its own people to keep its own people down. And that's the way it kind of runs. And so what you have in a bunch of these areas of the world during this time period then is a really simple game. The United States, used to be Britain, France, and Italy, but basically it's not a new game, would pour money into the ruling upper class. Well, during this time period, the Soviet Union would not pour money per se, because they often didn't have money, but they had the ability to mass produce things like weapons and, AK-47s and such, and they would give it to the working poor and basically tell them, why are you guys letting these guys run stuff, overthrow the system? And so this is going to be the area where we start, sadly, supporting some pretty brutal dictators to keep their own people down, because their own people have been kind of brainwashed by the Soviet Union and thinking that your job as workers of the world is to overthrow the rich guys. So these are going to be called wars of liberation by a future premier of Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, after Stalin dies. These wars of liberation are seen depending on how you turn the donkey. We see them as communist uprisings. The Soviet Union sees them as a chance for the people to finally take control of their own country. Now, before you get too schmaltzy with this or get too sounds Dell'Orto like you like the Soviet Union, why don't you go live in Russia then? Get the hell out of this country. Soviet Union is an amazingly brutal country during this time period. They are using these poor people at the bottom of their social pyramids. They don't really care about them. They're just pawns in the game. Pawns in our game. That's what we mean by proxy wars. So 1946. 1946, having exploded the atomic bomb 3 times, once on July 16th there in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and then twice, once in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, little boy, fat man. The United States decided in 1946 to hold a kind of public display about how devastatingly powerful these atomic weapons are, and they were called the Bikini Atolls. It was actually named Operation Crossroads. We're going to take some islands that we had liberated from the Japanese, and one of them were called the Bikini Islands, the Bikini Atoll, and it's an old rim of a volcano, and it's got a lagoon in there and stuff, and the people who lived here were called the Bikinians, and so we're going to move them off the island to a different island, and we're going to basically put a bunch of old Japanese ships that we had captured, and a couple of ours that have been so damaged that we can't really use them anymore. And we put them out there as if they were a flotilla getting ready to do a D-Day invasion, or possibly an invasion of Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Because we had never tested the atomic bomb on actually a water circumstance. We had done it on 2 cities and out in the desert. So we decided we're going to test these things. One was going to be Operation Test Able. They were going to drop that from a plane. It's going to detonate about 1,800 feet above the water, right over a Navy. Again, there's nobody living on these navies, so we don't have Japanese prisoners on these, but we do have goats and sheep. They're on these things to kind of be able to experiment the radioactivity and the devastating properties of these things, so we'll know what we don't know. The second one is going to be Test Baker, and Test Baker is the one you actually see here, and that was when we detonate from underwater as if an atomic bomb was on the tip of a torpedo and kind of hit a ship within about 100 feet or so of the depth. And then Operation Charlie was supposed to be at the actual bottom of the lagoon, hundreds of feet deep. They never did Operation Charlie because Operation Baker was so big and devastating, as you see here in front of you. They decided to call that one off. Operation Able really wasn't that big. It didn't have the kind of effect that they were hoping, and what they figured from physics of it is when you detonated the bomb up here, 1,800 feet above, what happened is most of that power comes from the blast. Well, then just like a big waterbed, the actual ocean just went and absorbed a lot of power, and a lot of those boats were pushed down. They had a little bit of cosmetic problems and some scarring from the heat, but really nothing else. This Operation Baker basically just created this almost typhoon of sorts and picked these things up. Well, it's not by accident that we get inspiration from things that are going on around us. And if you actually look at the fashion of the time period, most of the brassieres, the bras women are having these really kind of tipped, kind of cone type stuff. And that was actually where the inspiration was. Bathing suit wise, you used to have the one pieces. And then they went into the you can't show too much skin, but then they started showing more skin in World War II because remember, Congress had outlawed how much actual fabric you can use on stuff. So we're just being patriotically supportive of Congress when we have even shorter and skimpier bathing suits. And then the first public bikini made its play in 1946. The inventor actually got his inspiration by the bikini atoll test. That's where the name bikini comes from, the two-piece. So what we have then, there's Marilyn Monroe, we have it basically is an inspiration. Now, it's not just this that's going to give us inspiration. We're also going to have inspiration for what happens to animals that get radiated. For example, Godzilla is going to be imagined at this time period. He's an actually Japanese creation complete with a zipper that went down his back at first in the old movies. But he's supposed to be a radioactive lizard of some sort that evolved on this. So this new atomic power is really pretty cool in 1946, 47, and everyone's like, damn, look at that stuff. We even have an atomic cannon, and we use it once. But basically, this just gets into it. I mean, it's kind of like this fun new power we have. Music and everything. But 46 is still the transition year. So 46 is the first full year that the economy goes from a war economy to a peace economy, and the exact same thing happens that happened at the end of World War I. A bunch of these workers who didn't have enough stuff to buy. Remember, Congress made it illegal to make new cars, washers and dryers, refrigerators. You didn't have many clothes. All of a sudden, a bunch of people had a lot of pent-up money that they had saved. Those rosy riveters had saved a lot of money. The war ends, and all of a sudden, because there's a shortage of stuff, prices skyrocket. Just as workers go back to work saying, hey, we were really good workers through the war. We won the war. We beat the bad guys. Can we have our pay raise? Only to find the government and the company's going to go, yeah, we're actually going to cut you out because we used to be making tanks. We used to be rolling those tanks just like those B-29s, those B-24s off the assembly line. But now we have to cut back. We got to lay you off. So you're not getting a pay raise. You're actually getting 100% pay cut. We need to fire you. So, of course, as always, this all lands on the back of the president. So they get the glory. They get all their kind of like the calls on this. So it's going to lead to inflation in 1946. It's going to skyrocket through the roof. But what that ends up being is that in 1946, the midterm elections, the Republicans end up winning both houses of Congress. They've not had that since 1928. So they have that. Their actual slogan for that year was "Had enough." Had enough of the progressive movement of Part 2, just like Warren G. Money, Pimp Daddy Harding is going to have normalcy. The Republicans in 1946 have had enough. And having taken over the House and the Senate, they then kick in this kind of search for communists in America. It's the House Un-American Activities Committee. It actually had been out there in Congress in the 1930s. They looked for communists and they looked for Nazis. But now they're looking for pretty much Nazis. And this is going to be the thing where Richard Milhouse Nixon is going to get his fame and fortune as a freshman congressman. He's going to be put on this HUAC committee, and he's going to start looking for people all over the place that are spies. And it's going to be this Hiss trial where he finds an old State Department official that was sneaking in microfilm in like a pumpkin and such. And that's Alger Hiss. So this is going to make him famous, and we're going to be amped up on this. And as we get closer and closer, Britain basically gives a heads up to the United States and says, in so many words, bloody hell, we've been trying to help out with Iran and Turkey and these other places, but especially in Turkey and Greece, we can't help them anymore. We don't have any more money. That sounds kind of average. Anyways, so they come in and tell the United States, Harry Truman, that Greece is on the verge of having an internal civil war where the actual Communist Party is going to take over the country, and the same thing might happen in Europe. So if we cannot allow any country to fall to communism, we cannot allow it to fall to any kind of communism. It doesn't even have to be Soviet Union take you over communism. It could be any communism. And so in March of 1947, President Truman announces what is known as the Truman Doctrine. In essence, the Truman Doctrine is very simple, straightforward. It will be the policy of the United States, so a doctrine like the Monroe Doctrine. Europe, say out of Latin America, the Truman Doctrine, in essence, says it will be the policy of the United States to help any country facing a communist threat internally or externally, meaning we'll help you if you're fighting the Soviet Union, we'll help you if you're fighting your own rebels within your own country. It's kind of a blank check of sorts. And so this becomes known as containment. And it is, again, the anti of appeasement. It's the opposite of appeasement. Later, Dwight David Eisenhower is going to call it the domino theory. So one is basically Harry Truman's, the other is Dwight David Eisenhower's, but it's the same damn theory. It really is. It's the same theory all the way along. Let me get myself out of here a little bit. All right. So in this time period, as we're just beginning our first step in the Cold War, then we have this switch. And in 1947, Congress goes on these HUAC trials. They start pulling in all kinds of people, including people who made movies for the federal government to make everyone think the Russians were actually Russians and not Soviet Union kind of guys. So they bring people in. Even Walt Disney kind of lets them kind of go rummaging around trying to break up unions. He never liked unions anyways. I mean, I don't know many business owners who like unions. But Ronald Reagan was, the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he gives some names over to the FBI. And you end up having what are known as the Hollywood 10, and these are 10 producers, writers, a handful of other people who very well may have actually been communists. But you got to kind of explain this a little bit too. In the depths of the Great Depression, for 3.5 years, we kind of faltered and didn't have a lot of foundation. I mean, Hoover was trying to do some stuff. The Communist Party actually sounded like an alternative at the time period, and many people joined the Communist Party in the United States, only to turn around and find out the Communist Party of the United States was nothing more than an organization working for Stalin. So a lot of them would come to a meeting or two or three or four, and when they're young, like college age, and they're like, and they'd leave and never come back. But now it's on the record. So what you have are a handful of people, these Hollywood 10, who would not say anything. They took the fifth, and they end up getting in jail for a while. 1947 is also the same year that we start something called the Marshall Plan, named after George Marshall. He was the chief of staff of the entire armed forces for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and later he becomes Secretary of State for Truman. And he comes up, it's not his idea, but he basically presents it to the president, and the president then names it after him, something called the Marshall Plan. And that is where we're going to give billions upon billions. 18 billion are actually offered, 13 billion are actually taken to jumpstart the economy of Europe. And it's really simple. It's super, super simple. Harry Truman said it best: no man that's ever owned a house is a communist. Think about it for a second. The idea is, if you have a chance to get ahead and you have a chance to work for something and you have a chance to kind of get some money for something, you're not going to want to share that with somebody who's done nothing for it. Communism sounds great if you have nothing. But if you've worked for a little bit and you've got something and you've actually made some money, then communism doesn't sound like a very good system at all. So the idea that Marshall pointed out is that the communists are on the verge of winning in much of Europe democratically through the voting process, simply because Europe has fallen apart. After the war, they just can't get their footing. They can't get everything going. And they're going to become communist without us doing anything, without the Soviets doing anything. They're just going to do it on their own accord. Because if you're a starving family of 600 people, well, that's a pretty big family, but if there's 600 families sitting in a town and on the top of the hill lives Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or some billionaire, all of a sudden that kind of like Frankenstein monster mob, let's go get him with the pitchforks, it doesn't sound that bad if you're on the verge of starving and he's got $1 billion. Who needs $1 billion when me and my wife might lose our child in the next couple of days because of malnutrition? So the idea was communism was going to work without anything. So they came up with the idea of giving billions of dollars to Europe, and it's called the Marshall Plan, and it creates something called the European Recovery Plan, or you'll see it here in a while, this ERP. That is the baby first steps of what is now known as the European Union that Britain just got out of with the whole Brexit thing. Now, this Marshall Plan is going to be pretty cool. It gives a lot of money to Europe, and we don't expect it back. It's not like a loan. It's like something we did in the Dawes Act 1924. This is just, no, here you go. Now think about it, though, from an economic perspective. This is pretty smart, because it doesn't do any good to be the millionaire owner of the mall in town if nobody in your town can buy your stuff. So if the United States economy has to have customers, and our biggest trade partner in the world is Europe, we've got to jumpstart the economy of Europe, or else we're going to go down too. So some brilliance there. Second part of this that we need to kind of keep in mind is the Marshall Plan. Former Prime Minister Winston Churchill said was the most unsorted act in history. Sorted means dirty. In other words, to be unsorted means to be pure. This is the most pure act in history. Well, that's cool. American taxpayer dollars, $13 billion in today's money, probably around $300-400 billion. So, it's a good, decent chunk of change. $500 billion maybe. But it didn't come with just no strings. There were strings. So here are the three strings you're going to need to write down. So please get them in your notes, because I'll be looking for them. And if you don't have them, then I'm going to make sure that you get 0 points, and then you have to repeat your entire educational system again. You got to start in kindergarten and work your way back up. But hopefully by then, COVID will have been figured out. So you'll actually have like a junior prom, because you made it all the way through. Anyways, here's string number 1. Europe, if you're going to take our money, you didn't have to, but if you're going to take our money, and these are the yellow countries, the countries take our money, you cannot, for 10 years, that was the idea, raise tariffs against each other. Because if you raise tariffs against each other, you're going to keep growth from happening. One of the things we learned from the Great Depression is that Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act is that tariffs can utterly destroy the economy if you let them do it. and they can destroy global trade. So the idea was no internal tariffs for 10 years. That is the beginning of the idea of the European Union. In essence, what we're going to try to do with Europe is make a United States of Europe. We have no tariffs between states. You can't raise tariffs on something from Nevada. So we're going to let them trade back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That was the idea. String number two. String number two. String number two was Europe, for 10 years, if you're taking our money, you cannot raise tariffs on American products. Meaning, if we sell it cheaper and better, your people want it, you are not going to stop us from selling in your country. Thing number three. The United States reserves the right to raise tariffs on your countries for 10 years. So this Marshall Plan will go into effect from 1948 to 1958. And amazingly enough, in 1958, the United States economy now all of a sudden starts getting challenges from Europe and other places. So we're going to have a golden age of American economies that we'll talk about in the suburban thing here in a little while. Oh, by the way, also notice that Britain, that actually lost some of the least in the war, actually got some of the most money. France, you got yourself kicked up a little bit. Italy lost a bunch. I mean, some of these places. Anyways, when everything's said and done, we'll go into our next problem, and that is the Berlin Airlift. See, Berlin, again, if you remember, was a city deep inside of eastern section of Germany. And this whole western section was going to be France, the United States, and Britain. These sections, along with Russia, was supposed to kind of reunite Germany as a common country, demilitarized, certainly, within a number of years, but that didn't happen. As this Cold War starts, Russia basically goes, "Niet." Well, I know two Russian words. That means no, and it sounds like he said idiot, "Niet." So basically, they're going to stay communist. So it's a little communist puppet dictatorship. But Berlin itself, the home of about 2 to 3 million Germans, is actually also divided up. So the United States have been driving back and forth on the roads, on the railroads, back and forth, putting stuff in here. So in this early game of the Cold War, then the United States, Britain are basically trying to make East Germany look super poor. And we're trying to really highlight it by contrasting the poverty of a Soviet Union economic system, which never had much money, had a lot of manpower, but never much money. And right next door over here in our section, we started just pouring money in there. This became a place where we were doing what was known as working and fighting for the hearts and minds. In other words, we were trying to show that capitalism can give you a hell of a lot better life than communism can. Well, people started leaving by the tens of thousands, flooding across from Eastern Europe, trying to just get to Berlin. And from Berlin, they could then get on like a train or a car or even a plane and get out to freedom. So in June of 1948, Stalin says, "Yep," which again means nope, you idiot. And then he's going to call it off, and we're not going to have any more transfers back and forth. He closed it down. Now, this is not the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall comes in 1961, but it's for the same purpose. They just start stringing up a bunch of barbed wire and stuff like that, checkpoints. They got people out with their guns, and they're going to try to starve West Berlin. Remember our section over here. They're going to try to starve West Berlin into submission. His hope was that there could never be another example of how communism is so much worse of a system than economically enhanced capitalism. So for a year almost, we are going to deliver everything that city of 2.5 million people need on our side at least. Well, it's going to bleed into the 1948 elections, and that's going to happen in the summer of 1948, going into the actual first Tuesday in November. The election in 1948 was an interesting one because Harry Truman, for a number of different reasons, we'll talk about one of them when we get to the civil rights lecture, he will desegregate the armed forces, which is kind of cool. He'll call for a civil rights study and a civil rights act, and that just pisses off the South. And they will form a handful of them. 4 states will bolt the Democratic Party, and they'll call themselves the states' rights or the Dixiecrat, with the play on the word Mason-Dixon line, the Dixiecrat Party. So they leave. They were solid South Democrats. So they leave, which is going to make it harder for Harry Truman to get elected. Then on the other edge of the spectrum, you have the progressives, led by former Vice President Henry Wallace, who feel the United States is being too mean to Russia and we should be nicer to them. And so in essence, they go off and form their own little country, little party. So what you have is a Democratic Party that's splintered into 3 parts. And the Republicans, not only have they won both the House and Senate, but they're looking pretty slick with their really kind of cool guy, Tom Dewey. Former governor, actually governor of New York, so they're pushing for him. In the 1948 election, it looks like Dewey's going to win until the very last, when he didn't. And the Chicago Tribune, knowing that Dewey was going to win, wanting to go home for the night, sent their people home early, set their presses out, and printed this along with a couple other newspapers. Pretty certain the Republicans were going to win, and then they didn't. And in this election 1948, where you can see the Dixiecrats, those would have been Democratic states, so they obviously took some pull from Truman. Had he not lost those states, he would have had more over here and then more up there. Even Henry Wallace and those guys are going to get some votes. They just don't get enough to get some states. Now, when you look at it from a county-by-county perspective, then it kind of gives you another example of how these things work. So in 1948, Harry Truman wins, but it's not just Harry Truman. Look, down at the bottom. He gets back the House and the Senate. So finally, for really the first time in peace, Truman has a friendly Congress that he can work with. He starts to do variations of the New Deal, but it doesn't last very long. This air Berlin lift is still going on in that time period. Stalin's still got his arms wrapped around Berlin. He's still trying to strangle it to death, and Harry Truman is still sending in planes every single solitary day, dozens upon dozens, bringing everything they need from clothing to food to sugar to whatever. And again, it's called the Berlin Airlift. It's not just the United States, but it's the United States, Britain, and I think maybe France a little bit, but Canada. And so we're going to feed Berlin in 1948 going into 1949, and it's going to help influence those 1948 elections. Because to many Americans, it looks like Truman is finding the perfect way to basically challenge the Soviet Union without actually going to war with them again. So he's being able to keep them in there. It goes from June till May of 1949, and then finally the Soviet Union goes like, "Nyet," and they quit. Again, "Nyet" means you idiot. So in 1949, right after this, the United States decides this can't keep happening everywhere we go. We got to come up with something better. So the United States instigates and starts and then basically founds something called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So it's right over there, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. 1949. 1955, the Soviet Union will do their own Warsaw Pact. These will be like governments of communism that are kind of together and happy together one way or another. They know it, so they clap their hands. Remember, Washington's farewell address said no entangling alliances. 1949, we're now in an entangling alliance, and we are there till this very day. And there's many people who don't like us being there. So he, in essence, was very kind of probably in the grave, somewhere in heaven, somewhere in hell, wherever he's hanging out. He's probably pissed that we didn't listen to him. So we now have not listened to his no political parties. That lasted for about a day or so. We've now not listened, don't get involved in European wars. We've done now twice. And also the idea of entangling alliances, and we start that with NATO. The United States will also start to build military bases around the world in this time period, all over the place. And this keeps the economy humming because it's money being used to have private contractors build stuff for the American government. We're hiring more soldiers. They end up buying more stuff. The whole thing goes up and up and up and up. But we're all going in debt each given year. Now, if you notice, what we're trying to do if you're the Soviet Union is we're basically starting to surround them. And that's kind of to a certain extent what we do. So we got NATO on this side, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I'm not joking. CETO are these countries over here. That's the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And I am not joking. I am not joking. We actually have something called MEATO too. Sounds like some sort of spam product, like some fake meat type things. But MEATO actually is Middle East Asian Treaty Organization. 1949, another bad thing goes wrong for Harry Truman. In 1949, it is a really bad year. It's like the worst year of his presidency, even though he's had a handful of them. 1949, the Soviet Union explodes their first bomb, their first atomic bomb called Joe 1. And so our monopoly is no longer there. And that freaks us out. We start having what are called the duck and cover drills, where kids will be basically put on like some drill just to save their life by hiding behind a desk or hiding underneath something. Hopefully that the thing that was trying to kill them will go away. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Hiding underneath things, hoping that he'll stay. Anyway, so every generation's got its own duck and cover or lock down or, shelter in place or whatever happens to be the case. 1949 is also the year that China decided China didn't want to be China, the Republic anymore. It wanted to be China, the totalitarian dictatorship. China. So Chiang Kai-shek is going to have the premier. He will be pretty much the president of China, for lack of a better word. And he's fighting in the 1920s and the 1930s a communist leader by the name of Mao Zedong. And Mao has got the people behind him because China is so amazingly poor. But Chiang has got the power elite, who are the rich guys of all these warlords, all these different kind of areas. But he's trying to become the one major guy, and he's fighting these warlords. So there's not a whole lot he can do sometimes. But when Japan invades China in 1931, Mao sends his troops to go challenge them. Well, Chiang doesn't for the longest time. And when Chiang finally sends troops, he sends it to then attack Mao. So for many Chinese, it starts looking like, so wait a second. So our president, Chiang Kai-shek, is fighting our own guys. And those guys are trying to fight the Japanese. Who really should be rooting for this? Well, eventually in 1949, years later, Chiang Kai-shek, having lost a lot of his hair and his youthful vigor, will now become the sole premier of China. And Chiang Kai-shek and his group will jump all the way to the Formosa area, Taiwan, Taipei, and they will create the new mini little China. Well, that's China. That right there is not China, but that's the one that we have an actual official relationship with in a formal actual agreement at the time period. And in this era of containment, we in essence said, crap, now China's all communist unless we don't call it China. Then it'll just be this big land that doesn't necessarily, so that we call China. I'm not joking. That is what we call China. Now, if you remember back in 1945, when we came up with this League of Nations, now polished off to be the United Nations, they came up with a couple of different ideas. And one of them was in the General Assembly, everybody's going to have a vote in the General Assembly. Doesn't matter how big your country is. You could be the Vatican state and like 10 people live in yours. You could be China with 1 billion, 10, billion, 20, billion, 30. But they also created something called the Security Council. And the Security Council used to have in its inception 9 members, of which the United States, Britain, France, and USSR, and China were the actual permanent members. And any one of those could veto anything the General Assembly did. Well, when in this time period we start, it's going to have some interesting ramifications for the Korean War. So Stalin's our bad guy, Stalin's our bad guy, now China's our bad guy, now those two guys are trying to take things over, and they're even going to try to like abuse some guy's, desire to date some redhead girl who's now going to come and chop his hands off. And this is one of the comic books of the time period. Special, the secret of Norsec power battle cry. All right, so here we have then the Japanese Empire at the height of its time period. We invaded Tokyo. They didn't invade Tokyo, but we were afraid outside. Soviet forces, remember how the whole Cold War ended? Well, that rush down to the bottom of Korea became the 38th parallel line. And the Soviet Union put into power some guy, Kim Il-sung, some guy, who will then lead them. Well, Kim is counterbalanced in the south by our guy, Syngman Rhee. And Syngman Rhee is a pretty nasty dictator who we don't trust to have enough thoughtfulness to not launch a war against the North, so we don't give him a bunch of weapons. And then eventually, Syngman Rhee will find that the North will come plowing into the South. Now, Kim is going to try to reunite Korea. That's his main plan. He's gotten the "it's okay if you want to" call from the leader of this entire area, Stalin. But Stalin basically says, hey, the Americans come in and kick you in the teeth. Don't come crying to me. I'm not going to help you. You're on your own. So Stalin, in essence, has already learned his lesson with the atomic bomb. So he's staying out. But Kim, in essence, thinking that he's got his blessing, goes rolling across in June of 1950. So the Korean War starts. They catch the American troops, the South Korean troops, completely off guard at first. I mean, this is like a horrible bombardment. And we just keep getting reeled to the point where we are pushed down to what is known as the Pusan perimeter by the summer of 1950. And the Pusan perimeter is like right there. That's the city of Pusan. So it's basically around there, and our guys have been trapped. They've lost almost all of Korea. Now, at the moment then, Douglas MacArthur, who's been in Japan, who's now taken over the kind of running of this, says, we are going to do an Incheon invasion. We're going to come around the corner and launch an invasion and cut these guys off. It is called the Incheon invasion in September of 19. It's like the D-Day gone Korean War style, and it actually works. Our guys cut the actual North Korean forces off. We are able to isolate them down there, and then we start to push them up and out of Korea as fast as we can. Now, while this is happening, the President of the United States is consistently telling MacArthur, hey, just push them out to the 38th parallel and then stop, because we don't want to start like World War III with atomic bombs and everything like that, or China invading, because they got 1 billion people, and that's too much. And then MacArthur go, completely understanding, he pushed a little farther. And then Truman sent him another telegram, hey, that's great, stop where you are, that's everything good. And then boom, 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 and he kept moving all the way up to the Yellow River. The Yellow River is the river that separates China from North Korea through most of their actual shared border. And as it gets closer and closer, the United States starts to worry Mao Zedong and the communist leadership of China. So as they're getting closer and closer, Mao's like, So he sends kind of like a wake-up message to the United States. 300,000 plus troops will come across. When they get up to the Yellow River area, they'll be there for about a day and a half. They will just beat the living snot out of our guys. They'll retreat back the Chosin Reservoir and stuff like that. And then next day, they're like, done. Well, MacArthur had bombed the bridges along the Yellow River, but the Chinese had come across on foot. And in November of 1950, it's pretty cold, Korea. So they then come in. The Chinese come in afterwards. we continue the war. So the war basically seesaws back and forth. It goes, they're winning, then we're winning, then back to where it was. And this is going to lead to 1951's firing of Douglas MacArthur. President Harry Truman, seeing that he has defied all legitimate order, will fire General MacArthur for basically disobeying orders. And MacArthur comes back to an amazingly proud ticker tape parade. People just love him. He's like the old war hero. And he then goes and testifies before a joint session of Congress. Now, here's the part that is frustrating, I think, for me. MacArthur disobeyed direct presidential orders multiple times. Truman could have fired him way back when. So in June, when the war starts, the full first year is the 25th, and it goes all the way till the time period where Truman could have fired MacArthur, and they could have pulled back. At that moment in time, there was about 189,000 Koreans dead, with only 4 months of the war under our belt, and the U.S. dead numbered around 4,608, which is a big number. If you're one of the 4,608, or their parents, that's horrible. But the war will continue to go on. MacArthur won't be fired until April the following year, 1941, meaning it's about 37 months by the time everything's said and done. So in this war, the United States dead is going to be around 36,000. The Korean War dead is going to be a lot bigger than that, 2 million and some change. So the war could have been over here if Truman would have simply fired MacArthur for disobeying order. But instead, it's going to continue on, because even once he does fire MacArthur, MacArthur is going to be replaced by a guy that they were thinking about firing anyways. So he's fired for that reason. So here's kind of the reason. It's one of the reasons why Truman didn't fire him when he could have fired him. 1950 is a midterm election year, and Truman remembered the 2 years of having an opposition Congress in charge of stuff. So for the midterm elections of 1950, he in essence wanted to make sure he kept a friendly Congress. And that's what he got. He got a friendly Congress. And then almost after those guys came in and did their stuff, he fires one of the most popular people all in the United States, Douglas MacArthur. And as he does his little clip, old soldiers never die. They just fade away. That sounds exactly like him. And like that old soldier in that ballad, I now choose my military career and just fade away. And some guy starts clapping, but he wasn't supposed to clap yet because they had the script, so he can stop clapping. It's an awkward moment. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the sight to see that duty. Thank you, and good night. And in essence, like this, like, I just tried to be a good soldier, and now I'm going to just roll in a ditch someplace and die because I've done everything I can. Ironically, what he's trying to do is he's trying to get ready to run for president in 1952. And what else could propel you to the presidency than saving a country from communism? That was one of the reasons we now know that he was directly disobeying an order from the president that said stop at the Yellow River. And he decided, no, I think I'm going to keep going. So the Korean War could have been over in basically 4 or 5 months, and instead it ended up rolling on for 3 years. But let's take a look at how all the election stuff ended up going by the time it's said and done. Roosevelt had a long string of Democratic stuff. Hits the guy. He's able to kind of pull that all together. He's a way better politician than Hoover was. Truman was more like Hoover, so Truman couldn't quite hold it together quite the same, lose it in the 46 elections. But then all of a sudden, if you just notice this, if you are the Republican Party and you are out of power for that long and you become out of power of the Supreme Court too, you can start getting mean pretty quick. So what we're going to, again, be taking a look at in this time period is what's going to happen next in 1950, an election year, as this has all been happening. Well, we've been getting more and more into communism, and in 1950, Joe McCarthy had to run for re-election, and he was abysmally not respected in his district. So he then pulls out of a briefcase, I have 207 card-carrying members of the Communist Party the State Department knows about, and they have not done anything about. You're like, whoa, there's communists in the State Department. And he never gives a single name. The following day, he then pulls out another thing, and basically says, 2007 was actually 58 or something like that. So 58, that's all. And he keeps making up numbers. He never catches a single communist his entire life. But he will start to unleash this hatred, this kind of xenophobic fear of others, this nativist, waspy kind of thing that happens. And we're going to be looking at the fifth column. And the idea of the fifth column is somebody who is living amongst you, but is spying against you, like Klaus Fuchs had been spying against the British before he sold to the Canadians, not the Canadians, to the Russians, their weapon stuff. So McCarthyism starts a Red Scare number 2, 1950. Remember, McCarthy did not start McCarthyism. This fear of the communists taking over the country has been there before him. It was in the Palmer raids in the 19-teens, 1919, 1920. And it's because he's running for re-election. He really doesn't care. I swear, he never catches a single communist, not once. But he starts to change America. It starts to become this idea of just threatening people, scare people, find a way to get people all freaked out. Well, in 1952, Douglas MacArthur doesn't win, but instead, Dwight David Eisenhower, again, the man who single-handedly defeated Adolf Hitler. He wins, and along with him comes his Chief Justice, and that's going to be very important for the civil rights thing in a second. So his nickname is Ike. Richard Nixon's nickname is Dick. I don't know why. But anyways, the two of them win in this election, and Richard Nixon kind of gets caught with some money issues, and it's called the checker speech. So he has to basically tell everybody where his money came from. He does admit that he and his wife, with their 2 daughters, got a really cool dog that they call Checkers because it's white and black. And that is named as checker speech. And basically, Nixon says, I'm not a crook. He's going to say this again. And it works perfect. He uses TV to help get himself elected, and it's a clean sweep in 1952. They win the presidency, and they win the House, and they win the Senate, and they win the right to use oversized props all over the United States when giving speeches. So that's the 1952 election. As you can tell, it's kind of if you look across it, it's kind of the 1928 election, real close to it. Well, McCarthy's Red Scare starts looking for witchcraft, starts looking for those guys that are in the witch part, and then at the same time, in 1953, same year that Eisenhower wins, then starts, remember, it's going to be January 20th now that March 4th is over. Stalin dies within about a month or so, a month and a little bit after Ike wins and swears in his oath of office. So, without a communist leader that is such a terrible totalitarian dictator, Russia ends up getting a new guy called Nikita Khrushchev, who screams, "We'll bury you." And it's a quote taken out of context, but it's still kind of scary when it sounds like a Cold War. And the idea that we're going to have him someplace. Right there, he's like, they're blowing up the Washington Monument, with this big plunger. That's what the commies do. Well, this godless communism is going to be part of it. Now, McCarthy is going to try to push the Republican Party into ever more extreme versions of kind of allegations. These cartoons show you that the guy really in charge in America is Joe McCarthy, not the president. Joe McCarthy, not the president. The president's office, but it's Joe McCarthy is like signing all the foreign policy stuff. Well, ultimately, Joe McCarthy just completely crashes and burns in the 1954 Army McCarthy hearings. He and his associate, Roy Cohn, is a lawyer, decide that they're going to go after the Army because the Army has drafted a guy by the name of David Schein, who Roy Cohn had feelings for. Coming to find out later on, Roy Cohn was a homosexual man, and he had feelings for David Schein. And David Schein had been drafted by the Army, and they were trying to keep him from actually being drafted by saying that we really need him for a Senate kind of subcommittee that's going to go around and look at like all kinds of communist propaganda in Europe. In other words, we're going like a little mini honeymoon. Well, it doesn't. McCarthy ends up getting convinced by Roy Cohn to then basically claim that the Army is infiltrated with communists all over the place. Well, this is where Eisenhower finally says enough is enough. Eisenhower is a lifelong Army brat. He has been in the Army his entire life until finally decides to run for president. And he unleashes the Justice Department to basically challenge him. And that's Joe Welch over here. And it's called the Army, United States versus McCarthy. And so he is going to have live televised hearings. And it's when he then is live that the United States starts seeing that he's an incredibly horrible bully, that he makes stuff up, that he challenges people, he calls them names, he belittles them, he does all kinds of stuff. And his counsel, Roy Cohn, does the same thing. Roy Cohn is the guy who basically told him the art of tell a lie, don't apologize for it. If you get caught in a lie, then just lie again to cover it up. And the strategy, the thinking behind this is pretty slick if you think about it, sadly. Most people, when caught telling a lie, will then say, well, yeah, okay, and kind of give it up. So it goes against common sense that if you get caught in a lie, you then lie more, double down, lie even more. And that's going to be kind of his kind of idea for McCarthy. Well, later in life, Donald Trump will hire Roy Cohn to be his personal lawyer and to help him build his empire and his kind of credibility and his prestige. And later, Rupert Murdoch will actually hire Roy Cohn also to be kind of a legal advisor when they're putting together the Fox News channel. Roy Cohn, ironically, as a kind of a darling of the conservative Republican right that is often homophobic, will die of AIDS in this time period, never admitting that he was a homosexual man himself. which then leads to some other stuff. And this is just from the first, year, not even a full year of the presidency. In his first 10 months, the President Trump told nearly 6 times as many falsehoods as Obama did during his entire presidency. I know this is hard for those of you who like Trump, but Trump has a way of doing this. Now, his supporters basically say, well, that's just Trump. That's just the way he is. Okay. It's just the way he is. As of 2019, there have been over 10,000 documented lies or misleading statements. And those aren't things where he says something that he thinks he's right. He knowingly says something he knows is not. Well, this is kind of a leftover of the McCarthy era, the idea of trying to find ways to get things to go. All right, so we're going to talk about Dwight David Eisenhower in our next lecture, but that's where we leave off tonight, because who doesn't like Ike?